Bioshock is one of those franchises you mention once, and half the people nearby proclaim it's their favorite. It's not just considered a defining moment for 2007 and 2013, it's special because it's as generally popular as it is critically acclaimed. Now, while I'm not quite as smitten, you've gotta admit that it's had an outstanding amount of longevity. I mean, the first one came out 15 years ago, and that's almost old enough for a lot of Zoomers to consider it basically on par with Dinosaur Bones nowadays. And yet, still a lot of people cite it as their fave, or one of their favorite franchises of all time, both young and old. Throw Bioshock Infinite in the mix, and you've essentially got one of the most prolific game empires out there, despite having only 3 major entries, one of which a lot of people hate. But see, that's the thing, it's not really 3 entries at all. Because just like how most modern cities are built on the bones of the old, Bioshock's roots stretch all the way back into the ancient period some have dubbed the 90s. System Shock is such a surprisingly unknown franchise. For the longest time, I was convinced that purely by chance I had just happened to meet all the people who loved Bioshock, but I'd never heard of System Shock. Especially because the System Shock series popularized audio logs, a now well known and beloved, or more recently sort of hated, mechanic for fleshing out the characters and world of games. But to be fair, the whole reason Bioshock 1 even exists is because they had to repurpose System Shock 3 into something more marketable, after no one wanted to take a chance on a sequel to a super poorly selling game. And the roots of its past incarnation really show. The level design is nearly the same, the combat feel is just straight up identical, and the plot of Bioshock 1 and System Shock 2 are so close it'd be plagiarism if it weren't for the fact that these were made by a lot of the same people. And this is the point where I'd start talking about how either Bioshock 1 ruined what System Shock had nailed, or more commonly that Bioshock fixed all the things that made System Shock a flop. But in this particular instance, I actually think the whole which one did it better narrative doesn't really lead anywhere interesting, because it always ends up with the person picking which one is better based on how much they like the survival horror genre, with System Shock being the much creepier and resource scarce of the two. Though Bioshock retains some of the spooky factor, the emphasis is much more on the bombastic cinematic elements. Playing them back to back, they're actually way less different from each other than I had ever really realized, and this was despite me constantly calling Bioshock 1 a sequel. Now, I should make this clear, since despite my brain telling me everyone is aware of how these series are interconnected, most people actually aren't, so I guess I need to lay a little groundwork. Bioshock 1 is specifically a spiritual sequel, which means there's no plot connection, there's no lore connection, and despite me hoping to see some references in Infinite to System Shock being a parallel future, to my knowledge there's none of that either. So what people mean when they say Bioshock is a spiritual sequel is that it shares a lot of the same DNA. The audio logs are there, like I mentioned, but we're also talking vending machines, plasmids, tonics, enemies, hacking systems. I could go on for a long time. It's something that maybe you won't understand just by looking at the two, but once you play both, it'll be undeniable. Your Bioshock muscle memory will near instantly transfer over to System Shock 2. So let's start out with Bioshock 1 because it's probably what most people are most familiar with. And if you're diving into this subject, some might need a refresher. Or maybe there might be a lot of mechanical systems you didn't fully absorb playing through it only once or twice. Personally, I like to break Bioshock down into 3 major areas of gameplay. You've got your combat rooms, your story rooms, and your exploration rooms. And the idea is that difficulty and complexity in the game sort of ramps up as these different sections start overlapping and combining. At the start, it'll be really clear that when narrative stuff is going on, you're relatively safe and can relax a little. This lets them subvert that false sense of safety with occasional hectic moments, be it unexpected combat or just really intense character interactions. The danger ramps up slightly in the exploratory sections, where the occasional enemy or obstacle might be wandering around, but ultimately you're free to collect goodies, stuff your face, and learn about the lore of the laissez-faire hellhole you've been trapped in. Also of note is that these exploration sections are also where a lot of the creepy moments and jump scares are located, either to catch you off guard while you're trying to fill your pockets with loot, or to give certain locations psychological obstacles, as well as the standard physical ones. Your life is usually only really at risk in the high combat areas. Early on in the game, these will be in specific arena-like rooms or after key plot events. It's only later in the game when these fight rooms start bleeding into every section of Bioshock. And I think that's part of why a lot of fans feel that the last fourth of Bioshock 1 really goes downhill, because it's a game designed around cycling between locations and rooms, focused around a specific type of player interaction. So as they all begin to blend into one, the gameplay just isn't set up to handle the combination. It suddenly feels like you're rushing through a quick succession of different game modes without the carefully crafted transitions and pace of the earlier areas. It's a blender of content that's necessary to ramp up the tension, but ultimately leaves very little that feels focused and purposeful in the same way the first half of the game does. System Shock 2, on the other hand, has a very different approach. It never quite splits up its gameplay so distinctly. It starts out with a mix of the 3 that never gets unmixed. I think this does end up meaning that the start of System Shock 2 is nowhere near as memorable as Bioshock 1. But in exchange, instead of getting worse as it goes on, System Shock 2 only gets better and better as it figures out the best way of mixing these 3 elements. And that's key, because while Bioshock 1 ends up choosing a mix that's mostly intense combat with some narrative and exploration thrown in, System Shock 2 instead chooses a mix focused on exploration.
This is Xerxes. Remember, replicator restrictions are in place for the good of all of us. All unauthorized database interactions will be dealt with to the utmost degree of the law.
Marie, I'm sorry I've been out of touch, but I've been working on that artifact Bayless brought back from Tau City 5. I've done a level 3 analysis on it. I think it's some kind of artificial intelligence. I've managed to pull an audio tag file out of its memory. I'll let you be the judge. Marie, I think it's speaking English.
This works so well, I think, because if you really look at the bits people loved about Bioshock 1, it's those sections where you're poking around flooded rooms, scrounging for secrets while enemies mumble funny lines from a couple doors over. Yeah, the twists and turns of Bioshock 1's plot has really captured a lot of players' hearts, but they're not going to play through a game that's bad just because maybe they get a cool story at the end, especially if they don't know what's coming. The meat of the game has to be compelling, and the compelling meat of Bioshock 1 are the damp Art Deco spaces between main objectives. It's where the Big Daddy encounters take place. It's where all the memorable scares and tricks are. It has all the audio logs. It's the majority of the gameplay. I want to interject here really quickly, because I know a lot of Bioshock fans are going to look at this System Shock footage and just go, ew, ick, because the alt history fever dream of Rapture is just so much more artistically realized than System Shock 2's sterile starships. And I could go on about how one was made with much more advanced tech than the other, and how a System Shock 2 had been made in 2007 and it'd have equally as interesting of an environment, blah blah blah. That's all true, of course, but I feel like no one that you have to say that to is gonna buy into that anyway. It looks rudimentary, so it looks rudimentary. There's no point in going into what ifs if they can't physically play that what if. Though, to be fair, some System Shock remakes are on the horizon, so I'd keep my eye on that horizon if I were you. They have the potential to be some really cool reimaginings that might be that perfect what if. The second thing is, there's actually a lot of System Shock 2's environment that even sometimes supersedes Bioshock. In terms of layout, Bioshock makes almost no sense in real space. It's easy to get lost no matter how many times you play it, because all rooms are just randomly interconnected in whatever order the devs felt presented their encounters and secrets best. System Shock 2 is not like this. Every location feels like it has purpose. Every shortcut or transition to a new area gives you a much greater sense that you're scurrying around the belly of a starship, rather than Bioshock, where you'd have no idea you were in an underwater metropolis if it weren't for the views outside. What I'm basically getting at is System Shock 2 may not look the part on first glance when all you have to work with is someone else's footage, but when you actually feel it for yourself, trek across this sprawling colony ship with your own hands, I promise you'll find yourself more deeply immersed in the setting than almost any other game out there. It's creepy, it's cool, it's practical, it's over the top, it's a little mix of everything, just like a lot of the spaces in the real world. The more you play it, the more you can imagine what it'd be like to actually visit this place. Not that you would willingly want to. And that's what really makes System Shock 2 stand out most from Bioshock, I think. Not really the futuristic setting so much as what type of content is being focused on, and the pacing out of that content across every playthrough. Bioshock's world is extensively detailed and immersive and artistically complex, but it's still part of that magical realism genre, where it's purposefully disconnected from our reality a bit to emphasize certain themes. What I'm saying is that Bioshock is a commentary on our world masquerading as its own world. Whereas System Shock is down in the dirt, in the weeds, it doesn't want to criticize a theoretical society. It wants to say, you might already be living it, and just not have noticed.
In some ways, the many is not unlike the UNN. There's a joy in working towards a collective goal, and being able to put aside the things that draw us apart and make us separate. Why do we fear the loss of our individuality so much? Man can dream, but the many can accomplish.
I do love Bioshock's in-your-face political deconstruction, but there's something to really be said for System Shock 2's less theatrical approach, in all regards, including gameplay. Speaking of which, I think this really ties back into how differently these games ramp up their fun factor. If I was going to make a graph for it, and I totally am right now, I'd say that Bioshock 1 kinda goes like this. On the side we have, I'm gonna call it engagement, and on the bottom we have progression through the game. Bioshock 1 starts up here. Really strong, really impressive opening. Lots of new cool mechanics to figure out, then it dips a bit with all the fetch quests and backtracking, with a swing back up somewhere around the Cohen art section, but quickly continuing its decline again for the rest of the game, with a blip upon meeting Andrew Rhynes in person, but that's about it. System Shock 2, on the other hand, starts out a little below neutral, but steadily and consistently just goes up in a straight line from there. There's no major declines. Every new area is pretty much better than the last. The only dip you get is the meh final boss, but to be fair, both games have that. And in System Shock 2's defense, the narrative and emotional impact of the final boss is a lot better set up than Bioshock's. On the other hand, I'm actually a fan of the Frank Fontaine stuff. Unlike a lot of fans, I really like him as a major villain, so most people's version of this graph might be even harsher to Bioshock than mine. Of course, a lot of this is subjective, but I think it at least hits the major points a lot of people describe feeling about Bioshock's progression. And since almost no one has played System Shock 2, I can say whatever I want, and you can't say I'm wrong until you play it, so it's a win-win for me either way. This isn't to say that System Shock does everything better. I do want to talk about some major reasons I think Bioshock trounces System Shock, which led to it becoming so much more beloved and well-known. But that's for a little later, in order to understand why certain design choices made so much of a difference when a lot of the gameplay overlaps between the two. I think you have to zoom into the details of how System Shock 2 is intended to be played. And the best way I can think to do that is to create a little mini guide for Bioshock fans who want to try getting into System Shock 2 for the first time. Both because System Shock 2 has an undeservedly intimidating reputation, which I'd like to dispel, and more so because I think a guide helps clarify the mindset behind both games better than just talking about it in the abstract. When you first boot up a new game, you'll notice System Shock 2 starts out with a cool mechanic that, unlike all the other stuff, doesn't really have an analog in Bioshock. That being that you get to pick a class, and then more importantly get to pick the backstory of how you progress down that career path, each choice coming with different starting stats to mess around with. I think this can be intimidating for newer, younger players, just because modern games don't usually let you have this much freedom early on, and it's scary to think you could mess up your build right away. This is a pretty reasonable fear, and probably one of the reasons the game sold so poorly, but I want to state outright right now that the rumors you can get stuck because you don't have the right stats is a complete lie. The rumor started because the final boss is much easier if you have a lot of points in hacking, but it's still completely doable otherwise, especially because if you really want the easy route, you can just save up the auto-hack items the game occasionally gives you. The one thing that is required is a ranged weapon, but who's going to not have at least 1 point in some weapon skill on their first playthrough? But, you might interject, you did imply that there's some way to mess up your character right away, and that you should be scared of it. And yeah, I did, and it's twofold. First off, there's a huge amount of stats and skills to put points into, and it's not clear which are good or bad or when you will or won't need them. The easy solution to this is to just not put points into anything until you need it. If you're handling combat fine, don't put points into weapon skills. If you can hack everything you see, don't put points into that. If you haven't gotten far enough to find repair tools, there's no point leveling that up. I think specifically when it comes to your weapons, finding a weapon that's too high level for your build is a good way to gauge how high you should be speccing into those combat skills. Though, be careful, you won't be able to use everything in one playthrough. I'll always suggest picking standard and maybe one extra weapon skill for your first time. Your level up points will be saved. They don't disappear when you die, there's legit no reason to go crazy with them until late game when you're running around with 75 and no idea what to do with them. The second way to avoid making a bad build is if this is your first playthrough, don't pick OSA. It's tempting because you get psychic powers, but it's basically a new game plus class. This might be a bit confusing for newer gamers, but basically back in the day it was really common for devs to add in some kind of hard but creative way to play the game in order to add longevity for second playthroughs. I don't know why it was never labeled as such, but that's what OSA is. It's for veteran players who want to do wacky stuff and style on enemies. If you're mad that the psionic stuff is locked behind a difficulty wall, yeah, it's not great design, and we'll get to that when we talk about what Bioshock 1 really improved on. But it really should be noted that none of these classes are locked-in paths. They're really just starting archetypes that can mix and match abilities from every class. So if you want to try out some of System Shock's plasmids, because they legit are just plasmids, you can totally buy a few of them, especially mid to late game when you are just swimming in upgrade points. The one thing to be aware of is, just like in Bioshock, half of them are absolute trash, so try to choose the ones that look useful over stuff that just looks cool. When it comes to the last two classes, basically the only difference is that Navy's bonus of being able to hack stuff right away isn't super necessary, because you can get the points for it in the first area. So Marines tend to be the easiest, just because it makes the game more forgiving as you learn the combat flow. Though, to be fair, I played Navy first time, and I was fine. Now, getting more forgiving combat at the start might sound kinda useless, because most games nowadays have laughably easy starts just so you can learn how the game works. But a key difference from Bioshock is that here in System Shock, the item economy is much scarcer, and that carries over to your health as well. That being said, enemy health takes the same hit, so you won't be dealing with Bioshock-style bullet sponges. You might go down fast, but so does everyone else, making this a much more fast-paced game. To the point where playing them back-to-back, Bioshock 1 almost felt like treading through water. It was so sluggish in comparison. Also note, I said scarce, not limited. I'm sure a lot of people here survive a horror game with scarce items and think something along the lines of classic Resident Evil, where you had to carefully save everything, because otherwise you just run out. That's not the case here. There are some finite items, but they're mostly overpowered stuff, like special one-use tools. Ammo, health syringes, and money are all infinitely respawning, and there are vending machines just like in Bioshock that you can hack for better prices and just buy whatever you need. Once you unlock the first full heal station, you're basically set, because the cost of a full heal is so tiny you'll get your money back just by dropping one or two enemies. Plus, on top of this, a version of the Vita Chambers from Bioshock are in this game, so you can't die unless you're dying every 5 seconds, in which case just play on easy where they resurrect you free of charge. I will not judge. So, while this game has a certain reputation for difficulty and a somewhat intimidating opening level, the difficulty overall matches up decently well with Bioshock 1 once you get into the swing of things. I think ultimately the vibe of this game's gameplay is really clear from the start, with 3 major things to note. 1, you've got lean keys, meaning the devs intended for you to scope out the next room and plan your moves ahead of time instead of just blindly charging in. 2, your speed is insanely fast compared to Bioshock. Bioshock's movement speed is comparable to a System Shock 2 character with the lowest agility stat, meaning the higher you raise it with stats, or as I prefer with implants and plasmids, the more you can dodge almost every attack that comes at you. And a funny thing to note is you can actually end up going so fast using speed boosters that you take damage colliding with objects and walls, which is just such a sick feature. I'm so happy the devs included it. Finally, number 3, since you should be conserving ammo somewhat at the start, just because you don't have an overflowing wallet and inventory yet, you'll end up using the wrench a lot, just like in Bioshock. By the way, you can absolutely make a melee-focused build, and it's maybe one of the most fun ways to play the game. There's something just so funny about chasing around enemies slapstick style, and if the scares are too scary, I really recommend this build because it'll just turn every fight into a Three Stooges sketch.
Control by entering the authorized destructor code
'Anyway, like I was saying, you'll start off using the wrench a whole lot, and you'll notice that these enemies are actually quite smart and devious for their time. For example, the first melee enemies will actually do a backstep dodge when they anticipate your swing, so it's key to learn the animation patterns of each enemy and to bait them into wide open areas where they can be circle strafed. Enemies will chase you down once they see you, so you can essentially pull them back to a safer area and then ambush them as they round a corner, and this is pretty important for not getting hit, along with that circle strafing to keep them from getting a good lock on you. While this might be more punishing at first, it also makes even the weakest enemies so much more rewarding to fight, because you can essentially play some footsies with them, lunging in and out like two fencers going at it. I wouldn't say it's harder per se, it just requires a different mindset than most games where you're so tough that you can just tank hits and end up having to only worry about your damage output. System Shock 2 is all about abusing every advantage you get and leveraging enemy weaknesses. You're not some avatar of destruction like in Bioshock. All things considered, it's really easy to see why System Shock can be so adored by its few fans, but Bioshock can be much more beloved overall. Because while System Shock might have more for you in there if you're willing to adapt to the haunted corridors of the Von Braun, Bioshock chooses to go for a much more accessible entry to its City of Rapture. Sure, you begin just as helpless, but your hand is held a bit more and what's expected of you is a little bit less. A lot of people might consider this as Bioshock 1 having more freedom, and to a certain extent that's true. Bringing back a thought I never fully finished, I think Bioshock was super right to change the magic powers you get from a dedicated psychic build into supportive plasmids that can blend into any playstyle. If you get an option to cast some version of magic, most new players are going to be immediately drawn to picking it. You're essentially dangling a carrot in front of people and then not telling them they're going to get whacked with a stick hidden behind your back. Though, because Bioshock kinda allows you to do everything, your character development ends up looking pretty linear across multiple playthroughs, especially from the perspective of a System Shock fan. While clearly there are different builds you can choose from in Bioshock 1, they mostly boil down to what tonics you decide to slot in, which isn't helped at all by the fact that half the plasmids and tonics are barely worth the price. On top of which, in normal difficulty, you get enough Atom to buy more abilities than you can ever remember to use, or even need to use. Now, it's not like you don't run into the same overabundance of level up currency at the end of System Shock 2. But like I just said, that's near the end for the purposes of trying new skills outside your current build to tempt you into a second playthrough. I don't think the quality of every game should be based on how different you can run through it every time, but I imagine that when a game pitches itself as having RPG mechanics, that's what a lot of players are expecting out of it. And clearly there was enough for quite a few people to fall in love with the series. But I can't help but think that maybe there was a way to have both a massively accessible game while still retaining the freedom, creativity, and dynamic gameplay that kept so many people coming back to System Shock 2 for all of these years. Having talked to a lot of Bioshock fans, there's a lot of emphasis on that amazing first playthrough, and the more they say they've gone back to replay, the more of a bitter note I start to hear. Especially when compared to System Shock fans, who seem to only get deeper into the game after replaying it multiple times. I'm in a weird position, because while I obviously favor System Shock, I didn't play it until after all of the Bioshocks. In fact, one of the big reasons I checked it out was because of how disappointed I was in the lack of innovation with the Bioshock sequels. Sure, they came out with new stories and new aesthetics, but ultimately it was the same game going through the same routine with maybe a new plasmid or two to try to spice things up. I think it's important to cater to an audience that wants something familiar or doesn't want to require a lot of hard decisions, because obviously a lot of the time people are just too tired or worn out by the world to sit down and play something that feels like work to them. And while I wouldn't say System Shock 2 feels like work, it certainly requires a lot more of your concentration than Bioshock, for better or worse. No one is gonna dispute that, but I can't help but think that maybe there's some way to do both. I mean, we've got all these difficulty selections in games, but they're mostly focused on enemy health and damage. Yeah, they do raise and lower the prices of items and abilities, but it's really all just changing percentages that simply force you to play more efficiently. What if instead, or in addition, there was a difficulty option for character complexity? What I mean is something like this. When the game starts, you get two options. Let's say one is called simple and one is called complex, or something. I'm not married to the names. Complex is much more like System Shock 2, where there's a ton of different stats and skills to choose from. This would be the main build of the game from a developer's perspective. Simple doesn't remove any features, but what it does is combine a lot of them into fewer options that increase multiple aspects of your character at once, with level up currency adjusted accordingly. So, let's say strength, endurance, and heavy weapons get rolled into one more expensive stat called physique or something. Hack, research, and energy weapons get rolled into tech. Modify, maintenance, and repair get rolled into engineering. And this is just using System Shock 2 statistics as an example. I'm sure a Bioshock game would go for a slightly different spread. It'd allow you to roll psionics or plasmids or whatever into an existing skill set without forcing the player to spend a lot of points outside their build just to get powers that are cool. It'd make it easier to bring cool stuff back like the weapon modification system, rather than the stupid one-time upgrade stations Bioshock replaced it with. Because System Shock 2 has those stations, they just give you a special perk instead, and you modified weapons using a specific skill or special tool completely on the fly. I think a big part is I just find those perks so much more exciting and gratifying to discover than just a slight passive upgrade to damage or mag capacity. Like, don't get me wrong, the new weapon models can be cool and exciting, but it's just on a whole other level when you can pick an ability that completely changes your playstyle from that point on. There's nothing really like that in the Bioshock games. You're fighting at the end about the same as the start, just with a few more types of magic and a little faster paced. Which really defeats the point of an RPG. How do you evolve or even just roleplay with your character when they basically end up in the same place as they started? Sure, plot-wise there's an evolution of character, but one you really only experience during cutscenes, which you have no control or agency over. I think this does fit really well with the themes of Bioshock 1, and I wouldn't want them to do it over much differently, but it becomes a lot more confusing as the series goes on. It's almost like the devs are scared of giving you much agency over how your character interacts with the world around them in second-to-second gameplay. I don't know if it's a keep everything balanced thing, or more of a we want players to experience this game the way we specifically intended thing, or they just really like that meta theme a whole lot. But if any of that's the case, why even let you make a few level up choices at all? Why not make everything linear, allowing the devs to really flesh out these powers and tools to give them a ton of depth in terms of how they affect the environment and dictate combat flow? Instead, we get a system that's just a little spread out. You can choose a little bit, they affect the environment a little bit, but none of them go beyond any other game with similar mechanics. It's kind of like Bioshock tested the waters with a jack-of-all-trades system that's got just enough for a gamer of any sort, but not enough to be great at any of it. And like I said, that's fine at first, especially after a big flop. But I remember playing Infinite and just thinking to myself, wow, I would have had way more fun if this was a movie. Because all that kept me invested in playing the new game over just replaying Bioshock 1 was following the new story and learning more about the new characters and world. All of which a movie can do just as easily as a video game. I can't say the same for System Shock. I would love to see a great movie adaptation of a System Shock game, but I can't imagine it being able to capture the same feelings I get while playing it. I'm not saying this to bash on Bioshock because I think the first game would also be pretty difficult to adapt. But I just wonder how far the series can take this. If I was a dev trying to think up a Bioshock sequel and I was forced to work within this aggressively limited gameplay framework, sure, I could come up with all sorts of crazy new settings and alt history, half sci-fi concepts. But I could never make a new game whose mechanical gameplay matched its plot so closely like Bioshock 1 or even System Shock 2 did. And that is ultimately the lesson I really learned playing these games back to back, experiencing the transition from one series to another in real time. The essence that really carried over more than the way combat felt, or the items you get, or the vending machines you buy them from, was the feeling that both my time controlling the character and my time experiencing the plot were in perfect sync. And because of that, no matter what rabid fans of System Shock or Bioshock say, I'll always feel like these games are long-lost siblings. Yeah, maybe every once in a while I'll look at the Bioshock 1 concept art and imagine the System Shock 3 that never was. But it's hard to be fully disappointed by that. Because while Bioshock 1 may not have been what everyone wanted it to be, more importantly than that, it was exactly what it needed to be. Every design decision, good or bad, had some kind of purpose. It was a game bold enough to set a goal and go all out for it. Throw everything old up in the air to try to achieve something new and ambitious. And isn't that what we need so much nowadays? Less games that exist just to occupy people's time and wallets, and more games purposefully crafted in all aspects to achieve something the team was really passionate about. And I think, or at least hope, we're starting to see a shift away from the cookie-cutter popcorn game era of the late 2010s back into an industry where there's at least some room for artists to be free to make art. The release of Elden Ring in particular gave me a lot of hope for this kind of stuff because it nailed exactly what I'm trying to describe. It not only intertwined its gameplay and story with incredible focus, but was able to find ways to both give the mechanics depth and still allow for wide accessibility on a scale no other Souls-like game has ever managed to achieve. To me, it seems like accessibility and simplistic mechanics have become kind of adjacent terms, when in reality simplicity has always been a cheaty shortcut for broad appeal without having to spend the creative effort on making sure a game's design is purposeful. Because games like Elden Ring show the more intentional every mechanic and design choice is, the more people will be willing to sit down and absorb all the ideas you want to include in your game. You can widen your net by being as mechanically inoffensive as possible, or you can make players feel like the devs are with them every step of the way, encouraging them to learn and grow with the game. And there's maybe no better examples of that than the best of the Shocks, both bios and systems.